Hello, good evening. Good evening, friends of Penang Institute. Welcome to the first gathering of the year 2023. Now, today we are very lucky to have with us Professor Lim Sun Sun, author of the recent book called Transcendent Parenting. Sounds almost extraterrestrial or something, or spiritual perhaps. Transcendent Parenting, Raising Children in the Digital Age. Now, I will leave Gareth Richards to introduce Professor Lim properly, but I'm sure many of you are here tonight because of this interesting book title. Now, many new dimensions have been added to parenting just in the last few years, and the COVID lockdowns, I think, have brought these into sharp focus in many ways. As a parent myself, with the oldest child now 43 years old and the youngest 19, I do feel that parenting today is quite a different challenge from when my kids were kids, and that wasn't all that long ago. Now, a child has to grow well, physically, socially, intellectually, and with the technological disruptions in all these areas, along with the avalanche of information, entertainment, and opinions flooding our heads and determining our behaviors, it is difficult enough just being an adult. Being an adult endlessly worrying about one's children today certainly requires a coming together of parents and of policymakers and opinion makers to work out what the situation is and what the solutions can be. Having Professor Lim here today at Penang Institute as speaker for our first seminar of the year is a public signal in a way about how important we think this issue actually is. The young are the future, and parents are therefore the midwives of the future. Their responsibilities are heavy, and the first step in lessening that burden is to discuss them as innovatively and functionally as possible, as Professor Lim here will do. So let me welcome Professor Lim to Penang, and I will now welcome our perpetual collaborator, Gareth Richards, to introduce Professor Lim. Gareth?
Thank you very much, Kibe. So how's everybody? Happy New Year, 2023. Yeah, it's going to be a better year, is it? It's going to be a better year? It's going to be a better year. Okay, so very, very warm welcome on, what day of the week are we? Tuesday. First Tuesday of the new year. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here once again. So I'm going to say something here in front of my esteemed friend. So I moderated the last forum of 2022, it was like a week or so ago, with Citizen Nades, some of you will recall. And apparently I'm moderating a forum next week, Lim Ma Hui's book on the COVID pandemic, Global Structural Analysis. So I asked Kibeng how much it would cost to book in for bed and breakfast. I might as well not go home, I might as well just stay here. And he seemed to suggest that the new regime for this year is exploiting people as much as possible. So I'm glad to be part of your new regime, Kibeng. I first met Lim Sun Sun a few months ago in interesting circumstances, as they say. It was at Singapore's National Library, that wonderful, wonderful resource. And it was for a book launch. And I was doing what I always do, moderating a book launch of a former colleague of hers, Sandeep Ray. And it was an interesting exercise because it was launching both his new novel, but also a historical study of ethnographic film or colonial film in Indonesia. So a very interesting meeting of minds. And Sun was the, if you like, the host of the event. She puts it on and so on. And I first witnessed somebody who, it seemed to me, beyond her notional area of expertise, had this wonderful hinterland, this broad cultural hinterland, who could engage with a whole range of things. I said, that's my kind of transcendental friend. So she was transcending then, and she's certainly transcending in her work. A little bit more prosaically, let me tell you a little bit more about Sun. So she's got a very grandiose new title over the last couple of months. She changed universities. I don't know, people in Singapore change universities like you and I have hot dinners, you know. And so now I have to read this out because I daren't get it wrong. She's now vice president, the president of vice president, partnerships and engagement at Singapore Management University. That's in Singapore, for those of you who didn't know. But she's also concurrently professor of communication and technology at its College of Integrative Studies. Now, if that's not a mouthful, I don't know. I don't know what your business card looks like, son. It's like twice the size as anyone else's. As Ki Beng said, she recently published, actually written just before COVID and published right at the outset of COVID by Oxford University Press, this marvelous, marvelous book, Transcendent Parenting. And Oxford University Press are terrible at getting copies to us, so we will take orders for them if you're interested. Marvelous book in three senses. One, it synthesizes an enormous amount of literature out there, and as you can imagine, there's a huge amount of literature on the digital revolution and its social implications. That's for one. Secondly, there's a definite argument, there's a thesis running through the book. So it's not only synthesizing a whole body of work, but also it's pushing a particular analytical framework and an argument. But thirdly, and very importantly, it offers a critique of what's going on beyond the common sense. And I think that's highly, highly valuable. I said to Ki Beng when we proposed to do this evening that given Penang state government's intentions, or some people would say pretensions, to having a digital Penang project and whatever, I had hoped that policymakers and politicians would actually pay attention, because it seems to me that here in Malaysia, insufficient discourse is taking place in relationship to the deeper and wider social implications of digital revolution that takes place with us. The other thing about Sun, which I want to draw to your attention, she's also a very engaged, organic public intellectual. So she's not just stuck there in the ivory tower, so to speak. She was a nominated member of parliament from 2018 to 2020, so had a platform to advocate for the kinds of issues which exercise her in particular. And that also, by the way, includes digital rights of children and issues of harms, digital harms. And it's something I hope we can explore tonight. And also she writes extensively, South China Morning Post, Guardian, other outlines, so has a regular column. And I think that's also very important to act as a tribune for engaging a wider public beyond the academic field. So those are the qualities of the speaker that we have tonight. I think she's a singular voice. Can you please give a very warm Penang welcome to Professor Lim Sun Sun.
Thank you. Thank you. So grateful to this dear gentleman here whom I had the great honor and privilege to meet just a few months ago. He's really been a remarkable resource in terms of helping me understand how to shape my next book. I'm very privileged also to have the Penang Institute host this talk. I did write this book 3 years ago. It was published just on the eve of COVID, so to speak. So after the book came out, all my plans to do any kind of book launch or book tour basically were shelved. And I did do a couple of Zoom talks. And once COVID sort of passed, it seemed like old news, you know, to roll out a book events and so on. But then Gareth was so kind and so encouraging. And hey, you know, I am born to one of Penang's most a favorite son of Penang, if you will. Well, my husband is from Penang. So Penang is very dear to my heart. So for me to be able to launch the book and to talk about it in a country that my kids consider their second home, in an island that my kids consider their second home, is actually really special to me. So thank you all for coming. And I hope to, you know, share with you some of the ideas that I captured in this book. I do realize that it was written before the pandemic, but interestingly, because of the intense digitalization that occurred during the pandemic, I think you will see that some of what I talked about in the book were actually amplified and accentuated during the pandemic. So I hope you can draw interesting linkages with your own experiences. So without further ado, let me just say that my title, I was quite stuck thinking, wow, you know, my book talk at Penang Institute, what should I call it? And thankfully, while I was casting about for some ideas, I was inspired by the Penang Institute motto, which is making ideas work. So my my talk title for today pays homage to the Penang Institute mission, which is to make technology work for the family, digital connectivity, and the parenting burden. So essentially, my book was really very much motivated by a couple of issues that had been possessing me, if you will, after close to 20 years of having done research on technology and the family. So just to give you a sense of my career trajectory, when I finished my PhD in the UK and I returned to Singapore, it was 2003. So I had done my PhD around 2000 to 2003 in the wake of the dot-com boom. And I basically looked at how people were embracing the internet. I studied people who shopped exclusively online. I looked at online behavior, and I was completely intrigued and mystified by this whole business of people, you know, moving online in very many aspects of their lives. When I returned to Singapore in 2003, I felt like I had returned to a country I couldn't recognize, because when I went out, I saw people were sort of huddled over devices. In the homes, you were seeing more and more digital devices encroaching into the domestic space. And so I thought to myself, wow, this is really interesting, and someone's got to study it. And I thought, well, it might as well be me. So that's essentially how I started my career, my research career. I was really, really fascinated by how people engage with technology. And I really was seized with how it was changing the domestic sphere, particularly the family. So with the book in particular, after having done research on technology use in the household across countries as diverse as China, Singapore, Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, I decided that it was time to sit down and capture everything and to have this, you know, broad perspective. And interestingly, the whole idea of transcendent parenting, I couldn't you know, expunge it from my brain. It just kept following me everywhere I looked. I could see it, you know, pervading many aspects of everyday life. And I'll go into why I called it transcendent parenting. But I am not a new agey person. I don't do yoga. I never quite realized that transcendent had certain kinds of connotations. But you will understand why I came up with this term. So in the first instance, I was, as I said, really seized to understand how mobile media is used in parenting. But at the same time, as a parent myself, and also being surrounded by many peers, counterparts who are parents, I was also fascinated by having to understand how parenting was responding to the whole growth and explosion of mobile media. And so, you know, how mobile media and its really fierce sort of encroachment into everyday life was changing the way people were parenting. So this was something that intrigued me significantly. But let me just take a broader sort of sociological view and talk about the social and technological trends that form the backdrop of my arguments. So in the first instance, I think this photo that I've presented here will not be alien to many of you, right? You would recognize it from very famous bookstore chains that wouldn't be called bookshops like Gerakbudaya. They would be called more textbook shops, or worse, assessment bookshops, right? But these are shelves with assessment books that tell you about the extent to which academic achievement is emphasized in societies like Singapore's, and I would venture Malaysia's, as well as, you know, China, Korea, and so on. But essentially, the broader sociological trends that I was writing about is referencing the fact that Asian parents put a lot of stock into the academic achievement of their children. And so they expect that their children should do very well in school. They invest a lot of energy, a lot of their resources. And children are clearly expected to spend a good amount of their time hitting those high notes in their academic excellence, right? And so with this sort of broader emphasis on academic achievement, we're also seeing that technology is encroaching into the academic achievement race. And I will go into some detail with some examples later. But when we think also about the parenting priorities, we realize that within largely middle-class societies around the world, that there is a great deal of aspiration, especially among parents, for their children to exceed them, for their children to gain the essential qualifications necessary so that they can, you know, have good lives, their children can acquire good jobs, and so on. And so these parenting priorities of Asian parents are another really important part of the broader backdrop of my book. So I looked into all of the literature around parenting priorities, and there was a very clear thread of how there is active inculcation by parents in Asia for positive values in their children. And at the same time, you know, in other societies, in Western societies where you might sort of have greater stock put into the child's independence and autonomy, within Asian societies, there is every appreciation for the fact that parents should be protective. And this protection, this protectiveness, this supervision is not necessarily frowned upon. And that also is going to make its way into how technology is used, as you will see later. And then, of course, you know, just to underline that point I made earlier, there's concerted parental investment in children's academic achievements. So let me then walk you through the technological landscape. Now that we've talked about the sociological backdrop, you know, what about the technologizing landscape? And obviously, that's been something that we have all lived in the last 2 years through the pandemic, you know, thinking about how we switch to digital with lockdowns and so on. And certainly within schools, within the education system, you also saw a great deal of technologization and digitalization. So pre-pandemic, we were already seeing in a lot of countries around the world, but these examples predominantly are from Singapore. You will see that there is homeschool conferencing. So homeschool conferencing is actually a big term that refers to the communication between parents and the school to parents. And it's a very important part of the child's academic journey, because if the school and the parents are not communicating sufficiently well, then the parents aren't fully cognizant of how their kids are doing. They can't give their support. If the school isn't communicating sufficiently well to the parents, then the parents don't know how they can support the school. So homeschool parenting is actually a very critical ingredient in children's academic success, and especially for children who are not doing well in school. Because if you don't have homeschool conferencing, then, you know, kids unfortunately get left behind because parents are left out of the equation. So we will see through some of the examples that I show you that more and more schools are using homeschool conferencing infrastructure in the form of these kinds of apps where parents can keep track of things to do, like, you know, the fact that your kid's going to be attending the National Day Parade preview or making a trip to the zoo. And then the parents will be required to give consent, and parents will be able to use these kinds of apps to retrieve the information about their kids, how well they're doing, and so on. So besides that, you will also see that over the last few years, there's been an intensified use of all of these apps for parents and teachers to communicate directly, one-to-one. So this is not school to parents generically anymore. This is a specific teacher to a specific parent, right? And so you can see on the extreme left, there is a message from the teacher who says, spelling tomorrow, commonly misspelled words. And then it says to the parents, well done to the students, you know, who got full marks. And the last word that I said is always a challenging word. And so then in the middle one, there is another teacher using the Class Dojo app explaining that, oh, your child was given back their Chinese language paper to script and composition marks. And then there's a longish explanation of how the children did generically. For paper 2, please look through the paper and sign on the cover page. So generally, you can see that if you were a parent today, that you've got to actually be quite savvy to know how to use these kinds of apps to keep up with how your kids are doing in school. And on the right is a rather sort of delightful looking screen. Essentially, these are avatars that represent the children in the class. So it could be all of you, for example, but you would appear as avatars on my screen if I were your teacher. And then I could give each of you marks if you ask lots of questions. I could give Gareth 5 marks for his speech and so on, right? But at the end of the day, parents can look at the Class Dojo app and, you know, see how their kids have been performing in the classroom, which if you think about, parents could not previously do because, you know, you weren't there in your classroom with your child, but now virtually you are. So homeschool conferencing can take on these kinds of guises. And then, of course, just to give you some more examples, so those were proprietary apps, right, that are developed specifically for homeschool conferencing. But you will also see teachers use sort of generic apps, like on the left, a WhatsApp conversation. These are actual screenshots of phones of the parents that we interviewed. And on the left, you can see that the teachers using WhatsApp to message the parents. In the middle, there's more of Class Dojo. To the right is an app from a kindergarten where basically they tell you what kinds of resources the kids have been exposed to in the school and how you, as the parent, can let your child watch these videos to reinforce what they're learning in school. So homeschool conferencing has taken on very many different kinds of shapes and guises. And just a couple more. This one is really educational reinforcement. So there's something called Singapore Homework Help, where if your child has been set a piece of homework with a particularly challenging question, math usually, that you can't help to answer, you can actually take a screenshot of the math problem, post it, upload it, and in a while the solution will be emailed to you like magic. Voila. Obviously, nothing in this world is for free. Why are they motivated to do this? This is actually a free service run by tutors who are seeking your good business. So they will provide you with all these solutions. And at the same time, you know, besides these homework helpers, there are also all kinds of parent support groups on social media platforms such as Facebook, where parents can go and offer support, commiserate, you know, share exam tricks and tips and so on. But certainly you can see that homeschool conferencing can really appear and manifest in many different ways. So I wanted to then, you know, draw your attention to the fact that because of the intensity of technology use in homeschool conferencing, you do see parents feeling a little bit overwhelmed, clearly, right? When you've been notified, when you're getting all these messages across multiple diverse platforms, something's got to give. And so you can see from this particular parent, she says, I would love it if it's one seamless platform rather than to check all 3 platforms. This is one school, but for one school, I have to check 3 apps. It's a bit too much. I have to go into one for Malay, one for math, and these are school administrative things. And she says, oh, have I done this already? Have I done that already? But this was a parent, you know, who clearly felt quite overwhelmed by all of this homeschool conferencing busyness that she was constantly preoccupied with. Now, at the same time, you know, the digital learning tools that I showed you earlier, you can see that it sometimes actually contradicts what the parents want to do. The parents are trying to keep technology at bay, and yet the teachers are encouraging the parents to have their kids go online to watch more videos. And so this mother says that there's one we use for math at the school's initiative. We do this in the car on the way home from school because the teacher will notify us. So we will have a look at this and put it on in the car. It's a short video, so it's not so bad. And so you can see that there's this sense of equivocation, there's this sense of self-doubt that on the one hand, they want to do what the teacher is encouraging them, but there's some degree of discomfort, right? And so they've got to work around these issues of dissonance and so on. But interesting how parents all have to find their own coping strategies. So another situation where, again, parents felt somewhat conflicted, right? So the increasing use of Google Classroom that many schools started to use during the pandemic. This was pre-pandemic, but in the case of this particular parents, the school started to recommend Google Classroom. And so the daughter was tasked with this particular online activity that was actually far too advanced for the little girl. And so she says, instead of just writing, finding information on the web, you have to type and then you have to download pictures. I thought this was a task older kids can do better. My daughter is so little, so I have to help her a bit with how to do it. It's a bit complicated for her, although the teacher did brief them. So again, you can see how there's this sort of aggressive introduction of technology into the classroom, sometimes at a rate that might be too soon for the parents, and sometimes in a way that doesn't necessarily sit well with them. But, you know, resistance is futile, right? If the teacher wants it, if your child has to perform, then, you know, as the parent, you've got to support the child. So these are just one of the many different examples, right? And in this particular case, there was yet another example where the parents were actually deliberately keeping the child from not using technology. They wanted him to not be using computers until he was older, but the school said it was compulsory to do holiday homework online. And so they said, it will be necessary for us to teach my son to use a computer because he's not exposed. I had to familiarize him with how to use a mouse. When it's they use a lot of flash, it's very interactive, so you need a certain amount of maneuvering. And the parent says, sometimes it was tiring for us because we do not have school holidays. During school holidays, we still have work, but we have to still monitor the online homework. And again, you know, you're seeing that it's not just about the technology being used for conferencing anymore. It's actually being used for assessment. It's actually being used in homework, and sometimes at ages that the parents might not necessarily be prepared for. So I won't go into this one. I think I have very many of these examples. But I wanted to then, you know, bring the discussion to the whole issue of screens in schools, right? Which is that when you've got a broader educational environment that demands exposure to devices, that requires that your child get onto the IT bandwagon sooner than you expect, you find that as parents, you've got no choice. You've really got to upskill yourself in order to be able to provide that guidance, especially in academically competitive environments. And we also saw that schools and teachers, because of the broader discourse around digital learning, were also becoming a little bit more proactive about introducing digital technologies. And fundamentally, that because of the growing use of mobile communication in places like Singapore, that screens then became the main conduit for school-related information. And so, like it or not, you know, whether you were a parent who was technologically adept or less so, you had to find some way to understand how to use these kinds of platforms in order to provide the necessary parental support. So why transcendent parenting? So as I was telling you earlier, you know, I certainly had no delusions about being new agey. And people have asked me after reading my book with some disappointment, it's actually not transcendent parenting, is it? Because I think they thought that, you know, I was prescribing some formula that would allow them to transcend the pressures of parenting. When actually in my sort of rational scientific way, I was really using the word transcendence because it meant that you, as a parent, you've got to transcend many different aspects. And I will unpack that shortly. But the first thing I want to do is to lay some groundwork with regard to talking about parenting priorities. So earlier I had talked to you about the sociological landscape and how parenting priorities revolve around inculcating positive values in your children, protecting them, making sure that, you know, they're well-grounded and well-prepared for the future ahead. right? And so this was a particularly evocative interview that we had with a mother. And I thought she itemized it really nicely. And she said to us, number one thing, you've got to feed them physically so that they can keep up with their academic learning and emotional development. Number two, keep up with important dates in their lives, including exams, competitions, enrichment. Number three, supporting them and being their tuition teacher. And so very often when you talk to parents in Singapore, there is that sense of military precision about how they talk about their children's schedules. There is that sense of business mindedness about how they've got to do this, so that my child is ready for primary one, so that my child is ready for high school, and so on, right? And so there are all these parenting priorities that you will see, transpire in the way people talk about parenting. And then, of course, it's actually also underlined by more of the homeschool conferencing that I was talking about. So if you look at on the left is Kokolo, another of these apps that are used for homeschool conferencing. And on the left, you can see that there is the menu that the children will be eating in the daycare center. So as a parent, if you wanted to be really micromanaging, you could look into exactly what your child is eating. And then, you will also have the entire schedule of their days and what they're going to get up to. And yet, despite all of this, you will see parents who see the virtues of such apps. And in this particular one, it's a little bit long, but I'll just point out some of the important things. She said, this is a working mother. And she said, after I started to use Class Dojo, I'm more involved as a working mom. Working moms always have this guilty feeling because we don't have more time for the child. For myself, I have to work late. By the time I reach home, she may already be asleep, but throughout the day, I can check the app anytime. If I know homework, I will share with my husband. Just take note, I will be late. I won't be home early. Maybe he can help to guide her and share my burden. Sometimes I'm scared that I will forget. I will WhatsApp him because there are so many things. Last time, without all these apps, I had to call the school, and then they would say I would have to email. It was a struggle. You had to call. We were busy with your work, meetings, and all that. And by the time you remembered to call the teacher, that had already left the school. And so this particular, interview quote is really evocative because it shows the struggle, and yet it also demonstrates the liberation to some extent that the app has really granted her, right? Because she feels this sense of actually being connected to the child and being attuned to the child's needs and, learning journey while she's busy with her work. And yet, I hope you can get a sense of how it seems that she is constantly parenting, whether her child is by her side or out of sight. So that's why transcendent parenting, because parents must transcend every media consumption environments that their children may enter by themselves and with their peers. So when my kids are, with their friends, I'm curious about what they're doing with their friends, right? But when my kids are online, I'm also curious about who they're meeting online. And so, I've got to transcend the online and the offline realms, right? I think every parent today struggles to some extent with that. And at the same time, I've also got to think about the fact that my children are interacting socially in these two environments. And the last aspect of transcendent parenting is the fact that we've got to transcend what the great sociologist Manuel Castells called timeless time, which is that essentially, our lives are so interconnected. There's constant whir of activity that we seem to never be stopping. And in this particular case, I thought that parents have to transcend all of the different kinds of realms of their lives, but continue to be parenting across all of these different realms. So whether they were working professionally and focusing on their work, part of them was still thinking about their parenting responsibilities, like that mom and the Class Dojo, right? And when a lot of the parents that I spoke to for the book, they would tell me about how at the end of the day, when the kids had gone to bed, was when they would go online to the WhatsApp chat to set up all kinds of things for their kids, check on, the spelling list and so on. And so again, there's that timeless time with the whole ceaselessness of parenting duties. So in the first instance, let me just share with you a couple of quotes that link to these different aspects of transcendent parenting. So when parents must transcend every media consumption environment that their children may enter, you can see from this mother, she says that when I see my son sending any WhatsApp message that's inappropriate, I will scold him. Don't you think your friend can just screenshot and tell their mothers, can you mind your language, please? So in this particular case, the mother is clearly very keen to make sure that her son is behaving well in his online interactions, and that he's not, bringing upon himself some untold consequences. And she says, I'm the evil mom. I'm very strict. My son calls me. Then she says, another mother says, he was calling the teacher names in the whole chat group. I can't remember what it was. I had to tell my son, even though the teacher may have scolded you wrongly, you cannot say things like that in front of everybody. And so it's quite interesting, because if you think about pre-mobile communication, if your child went and said all kinds of rude things to the teachers, you had no idea. You simply had no idea. But now you can actually take your kid's phone, surveil how they've been talking to people, and guiding them and saying, that's not how you talk to people, right? And so, you've got to really transcend your kids' physical existence as well as their online ones. Now, this one is a really fascinating example, because in my book, I talk about how parents, to some extent, because of their over-involvement through mobile media, actually become too interventionist. And so this was a particular incident where a couple of boys went to kick about a football during the recess period. And one of them, I think, kicked someone accidentally. And so the father wrote this long email that's titled "Punch Up in School Field." So it's like incident report, and there's a timestamp and everything, right? And he says, "Dear Madam so-and-so, the teacher, apologies to inconvenience you during this holiday period. My son told me he was involved in a punch-up over a misunderstanding during football at recess. Details as follows." And then he goes on to explain that at some point during the game, a free kick was given to the team that was opposing. Unknowingly, so-and-so mistakenly kicked the ball. At this point, it is not known if other people witnessed this incident. But I mean, apart from the humor in this that we can see, the father was really very impassioned about the fact that this incident had occurred, and he had felt motivated and enough to write to the teacher, really to fight for some justice for his son, who clearly had been wrongly accused of having committed this, offense in the recess incident, hence punch up in the school field. And what I argue in my book is that when parents intervene like this, they rob the children of the autonomy and the independence to actually have gone to the teacher to share their side of the story, to speak in their own defense, and to advocate for themselves. I know that there are children out there who do suffer from bullying, where parents do need to get involved. But from what we could gather from this data, it did not seem like one of those instances. And this is just one of the examples that I capture in my book. There are other examples in my book where there are WhatsApp squabbles between two girls, where the mothers get involved, take screenshots of the arguments, send the screenshots to the teachers, report it to the school, and so on, right? And what I was saying in the book was that what could otherwise have been, child-to-child interactions, squabbles that could have blown over, suddenly, escalated so fiercely with the parents being involved and so on. And again, you've got to think about at what cost is this done to the child's development, right? To their social emotional development, to them taking ownership of their struggles and their situations that they encounter. So finally, the whole issue of timeless time, right? So again, with that mother talking about class dojo, you will see that there are parents who feel that they are liberated by these notifications, but there are also parents who feel burdened, who feel overwhelmed, and who wish that some of these would just go away. And so this particular mother says, I receive a lot of ping, 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 and you have to set the WhatsApp group to silence because there are over 100 photos of the school excursion that are being sent by the parent volunteers, right? And so, so far, nobody has left this group. I think it's because it's active participation in your child's school life. I mute it. It's too many messages. It's quite distracting because sometimes I need to do other things. And so you can see this is just another of the screenshots that shows you how photos can be shared in the chat and so on. Now, this one, I just want to walk you through the screenshots because it can show the degree to which sometimes teachers want to draw parents into classroom situations. So in this particular case, you can see the Chinese teacher has given all kinds of instructions, and she says, please take the following actions. Remind him to complete work during the New Year holiday, provide necessary guidance, check works are all stamped, etc. And then directly, specifically to the mother, I would like to seek I would like to seek your help with talking to him about his behavior in class. I have told the details to his grandfather yesterday. And then at the same time, you can see that she's also appended all the screenshots of his assessment and where he's gone wrong and where she's, wanting the mother to pay attention and everything, right? And then finally, the mother replies, yes, yesterday my dad already told me about it. I will dig into his bag to make sure he does his homework. And then the teacher says, not just the noise, he will walk around and disturb, sometimes hitting people. And the poor mother says, hitting people? Okay, we'll talk to him later. But you can imagine if you were a working parent, and here you are, you're trying to do what your boss asked you to do. You're trying to focus. And then you get these string of messages. Honestly, could you, still do your work properly? And that's how I felt that, this whole ceaselessness of parenting, the relentlessness of it all, it's basically happening to many people in much of the time. Yes, so these are just more of the same, very similar, but the teachers giving all kinds of instructions for parents to provide more support and reinforcement to the kids. And another example of timeless time is the WhatsApp group. And I love this sentence because the mother says, with the WhatsApp group for the parents, I really feel that I also go to school with them. Now, what is this amazing resource called the WhatsApp group for parents? It's essentially the WhatsApp group of all the parents of all the kids in the same class, right? And sometimes these WhatsApp groups can be such lifesavers because, you can't remember if the child is supposed to turn up with a red t-shirt tomorrow for National Day or something, and you send out a quick question and someone will reply, or 10 mummies will reply, right? But at the same time, these chats are also where there is a lot of sharing about, my son has done this, my child goes to this tuition center, my daughter takes this enrichment class, and so on. And so there is that peer pressure that parents experience from seeing all of these posts, and some of them feel really quite daunted and intimidated by what other parents are doing. And what these chats essentially do is that they set unhealthy norms around what is required of parents, and parents who aren't doing all of these things feel that sense of inadequacy. They feel almost derelict and neglectful. And that's, again, something that we really need to think about. So this other one, the mother talks about how when her son has exams, she will literally kind of like be teaching him. She will Google to watch videos and sign up for Facebook and learn how to teach her son better. So again, that sense of having to always be that dutiful parent. And then this is where, you know, I talk about the peer pressure, right? So this mother says, I heard from my colleagues and friends that other parents will compare. I think the information is too much. I know that it can be quite stressful because these parents will start to compare. They will start to send their kids to a lot of enrichment classes. So there's that sense of ambivalence and equivocation as well. So I will just skip along. So I wanted to say that clearly you've got parents who are pressured by all of these, but they are in a bind too, because they know that if they were to opt out of these WhatsApp chat groups, that they will lose out on a lot of information, that they will then not be able to help their kids keep up. So they've got mixed feelings. And if there were any other place besides Singapore where I could use this term kiasu parent mentality, it is this little island of Penang. So the kiasu parent mentality, the FOMO, the fear of losing out, you know, it's real, it's strong. As a parent, you feel like it is your duty to remain in these chats so that you can see what's going on and that your child will not be left behind. And so for a lot of these parents who are struggling with the imposition of transcendent parenting, they've got to think about how to strike a balance between access, getting it, and excess, which is too much of it. So just to wrap up and maybe draw some linkages with the broader global trends, I've presented this talk to various audiences. I remember when I presented it in Copenhagen in Denmark, they actually stopped me and said, please explain to us this kiasu syndrome, because we feel like we are kiasu too. And then I said, yes, you can say that, wow, it's only October, but they've already got their Christmas tree up. They're so kiasu. And then they were like, yeah, we get it. But they certainly could connect with the whole concept of kiasu, right? And so I wanted to then, you know, talk about how actually a lot of what I've described in terms of the technological trends, in terms of the social aspirations, you're seeing it in many other countries. So in China, for example, the city of Chongqing mandated that all educational institutions set up official WeChat accounts to facilitate teachers' communication with parents and students. And then the app will also notify the parents so that the parents will remember to make sure that their kids complete the homework. And then, of course, in the US, there's a fantastic quote from a book by Julie Liscott Hames, who was the Dean of Students at University of Stanford. And she wrote this great book, and she said, Don's ex-wife calls to tell him to go on the parent portal and check what's due in their son's classes, to make sure he turned in all his work, and to call the teacher if there's a discrepancy between what their son says he has done and what the online system indicates. Don sighs heavily as he relays this. So again, you know, it's not a kiasu Asian thing, right? And then, of course, Britain, you also see British parents increasingly using close messaging features in apps like Bambizo, Class Dojo, and Edmodo to contact teachers throughout the day with trivial requests, such as asking teachers to convey messages to their kids, and so on. And the writer observes that such abuses serve only to fuel a form of precision parenting that slowly chips away at a child's long-term resistance. So I would venture that, you know, transcendent parenting is not necessarily something that is specific, peculiar to Singapore or Asian societies with academic achievement cultures. We do see a certain universalization of parenting, especially among the middle class, because the middle class around the world are bound together by a host of context-specific desires, aspirations, and anxieties. So if you're interested, my book is not available on my website, but many of the op-eds that I have written about digital parenting are. Full text is available, so you're welcome to check that out. But these are actually my two children, much younger. But thank you so much for your attention.
That's totally brilliant. Since the children are here in the audience, don't you think we should call them as the expert witnesses for the prosecution? Superb talk, absolutely superb talk, and reflective of a lot of what's contained in this really brilliant book. It's 150 pages. It contains and absorbs just so much thought and critical thinking at that. So the way I thought we'd do the session is that Sun and I would be in conversation. I've read the book twice now. I'd like to interrogate a few things in the book and then very much want to open up the floor to this. I'm probably the least qualified person to be actually talking to Sun about this. I'll tell you for a number of reasons. To the best of my knowledge, I don't have any kids. So parenting, although I'm a godless godfather. I'm of the Marlon Brando style of godfather, by the way. And I don't have a smartphone. I have a very, very stupid phone. It's 15 years old.
It's not transcendent anymore.
No. As Ki Beng and I, Ki Beng leant over in the middle of all of that and said, "Aren't you glad we grew up before all of this?" He said. Oh, no, that got the biggest applause of the day. That's fantastic. And then, of course, we grew up at a time and of a particular ethos where we thought this was all transcendental meditation. So I sat there doing Om, and I didn't get any enlightenment anyway. No, I would like to unpack. And the first thing I want to ask you, Sun, actually comes back to your final slide, because you talked there about the kind of universalization of some of these trends and so on. And I had a worry all the way through reading the book because I thought your use of Asian was very slippery sometimes. So when you started, you do talk about drawing on a lot of comparative examples. However, Singapore is the main example, and so on. And of course, in some senses, in terms of geography, economy, politics, and social relations, Singapore is highly exceptional in not only in the region but globally. And I wondered about your use of sort of lumping together this notion of Asian without maybe always recognizing the sheer diversity of that. And we can come later to talk about certainly in class terms and in other terms. So is this a phenomenon that is particularly middle class, and what do you precisely mean by that? And I also felt sometimes you set up something called the West as a straw man in opposition to that. So you had this nice clear-cut sense of differences until you went to Copenhagen and they told you that Danish people are just like Penang Chinese people, actually. So I like just to begin to sort of look at the way in which we can see trends and patterns that are commonplace versus systemic diversities that are historical, that are structural, that are ideological, that are political and are social. Just unpack your terms of reference a little bit.
So those are very big questions. So I'll do my best. So with regard to Asia, clearly, you're right that there's that huge diversity, and Singapore, on some levels, is quite peculiar, right? Which is why in the book I really focused on what I call the urban middle class, because in my research also on broader mobilization trends across the world, as well as specifically Asia, you did see urban middle class societies, whether it was Beijing, where I also did in-home interviews, or whether it was Seoul or Jakarta, Singapore, as well as Ho Chi Minh City. We did see similar trends of mobile communication being more avidly used, not just within the household, but also the organizations and institutions that children were receiving care from, whether it was schools, whether it was enrichment centers, whether it was daycare centers, and so on. And so the growing use of technology across many of these urban Asian middle-class societies was a clear thread that ran across the different Asian countries that I've had the fortune to research into. And more broadly, when you think about the middle class, not just in Singapore, you see this growing discourse around the aspirations of the middle class and the quest for upward mobility. So it's not just a case of Asian parents wanting their kids to have a better life than them. Middle-class parents in the UK, in Scandinavia, in the US, and so on, they want the same, right? And so there's also that same concern for their kids to be outdoing others, whether it's at sports or whether it's at academic excellence. And so the parental investment by the middle class who have that disposable income, who have that affluence, who've also got that intellectual wherewithal to navigate opportunities for their children to gain social capital, is something that I consider to be quite universalizing across the middle class, the urban middle class around the world.
So it's reflective of these kind of urban oases, if you like. But is it possible, do you think, at least at the level of projecting trends, to extrapolate that to the broader society? I mean, I decided to look up the figures for internet penetration and usage just in ASEAN. And aside from Singapore and Brunei, the figures are not astonishingly high. I was surprised. So even in Malaysia, it's like 70 to 75%. Philippines is a little bit lower. At Thailand, and we're not talking about Vietnam or Cambodia and so on. So what I saw there was a very fractured sense of access to even the most basic infrastructural elements, without which, of course, the discursive and the pedagogical aspects can't actually exist. So is this something you see almost like there's a trajectory that is almost bound to exponentially grow in that direction? Or do you think there are possible impediments or barriers to that proliferation?
I think actually it will grow for very many reasons besides parenting, which is that when you look at mobile communication and how it's expanded its reach across Asia as well as the rest of the world, you've seen that mobile communication, especially during the pandemic, has been so actively utilized in all kinds of things, from healthcare to banking. You're looking at vast numbers of people who were previously considered unbanked, who now have access to banking through mobile phones, even through more primitive mobile phones like yours. You will also be able to draw on your mobile credit to pay for things. So mobile communication has actually penetrated societies across developed and developing spheres, simply because of the democratizing potential that it has in terms of offering services that are critical, that need to be more widespread. So again, if you think about mobile health in Africa, that's also expanded, right? And so the fact that these devices have also become much more inexpensive over time has also led to their growing ubiquity. And now that governments have been able to see their potential in offering services to people who were otherwise previously less accessible, I believe that, in the realm of education, for example, you will also see a more aggressive deployment of mobile communication in education for children across less developed regions in the world.
So you project a fairly optimistic picture that this digital divide can be bridged, at least to some extent, inevitably so. Okay, so that's class we've talked about. I want to talk about, I was wondering when you were going to pick it up, and it's in your final chapter of the book. So it's transcendent parenting. But nearly all the examples that Sun gives are of mothers, are of women. And so gender becomes the issue. And then the middle class, linking the class and gender aspect. Of course, many mothers can cope with this incredible swell of demands on them, because as middle class parents, they also hire home help, other women, migrant workers very often. So we have this interesting set of layers. And you said, you're damned that you're going to call this book transcendental mothering. It's parenting. No, she actually makes that statement. But it's like almost like a normative wish or a projected ideal rather than actual empirical reality as it is. And you offer a number of reasons. Some of them are structural, some of them are sort of ideological or ideational and whatever. I wonder if you'd address that, the whole gender issue and the fact that what you've described is hugely burdensome but unequally so within the family unit.
I'm glad you brought this up because when we were recruiting the parents for the interviews, we would actually phrase it in a gender neutral way. We would say we would want to interview the parents and so on. Eventually, 9 times out of 10, it was the mothers who would put themselves up for the interview. We did speak to a few fathers, punch up in Schoolfield and so on. We did speak to a few, but invariably, most of the people who participated were mothers. And the other issue is something that is also not just structural, you could call it practical. In schools in Singapore, they will record or request the contact details of both parents. Very often, it seems like it's the mothers who will respond to the school's requests. And then after a while, the teachers just will talk to the mothers because they realize that the fathers weren't responding. And then I speak to these couples where, both parents are on the WhatsApp chat and the father says, yeah, after a while, I just quit the chat. It was so boring. And anyway, my wife will take care of it, right? And so there's a lot of the gender norming that's going on. And in parts of my book, I also address the fact that there are many online platforms that provide mommy blogs and so on that provide tips about parenting. And again, there is that gendering, right, of what mothers must do. So there is that sense of duty and responsibility that women then feel that they've got to live up to as mothers. And I think that kind of norming is much less pronounced for fathers. So I refuse to call the book Transcendent Mothering because it's aspirational for me. I believe that one day it should be transcendent parenting. And I believe that in my household, it is that way. And increasingly in many households, it is also that way, that I see fathers who are equally invested in their children's, lives, daily schedules, educational needs, and so on. So I don't think the game is over. I think we will make progress. And I do see it, with the provision of paternity leave, for example. You're seeing more countries provide paternity leave, provide longer paternity leave. You're seeing more companies allowing fathers to take paternity leave and so on. So I think we can make that call.
I did warn you, I'd be calling on Win and Rin to be the witnesses, and they can attest to whether Alan is truly the equal partner in the digital family. Let's see. A couple of more things before I'd really like to open it up to the floor, because lots of people in this room do indeed have children who have experienced what you've described, and particularly have something to say, I think, about the impact of the pandemic on a range of these issues. Now, before I got to page 153 in the book, I kept on thinking in my sort of historical sociological head of good old Jeremy Bentham. Those of you who don't know, Jeremy Bentham, utilitarian philosopher, who in 1786, I believe, drew up this plan for the panopticon, the all-seeing. Panopticon, can see all around, yeah, and it was a prison, actually, with a watchtower, in which the prisoners couldn't see the guards or whatever because lights were on, but they could be seen at all time, and that induced behavior modification. 200 years later, in the 1980s, Michel Foucault picked up this idea of the panopticon in his book, what is it, Unpunish? Discipline and Punish. It's a very, very interesting book. And I kept on thinking, what Sun is describing is the panopticon. It's the all-seeing, all-pervasive eye. In her first slide, she used the word incursion. To me, incursion's not a terribly neutral word. I mean, it has at least carries or denotes a notion of perhaps threat or unwelcomeness. So I was thinking, is this becoming a world of basically modern surveillance, And you did use surveillance and parents surveying their kids at all times, seeming to demand the right so to do, and so on. And then finally, you actually wrote in the book, the perennial panoptic state. So it's there in the book. And that links me to the other question of the relinquishing of autonomy and privacy. That seems to be embedded deeply in this. And it's not simply at the level at which you're looking at how it's interfacing. Companies, this is not a neutral thing, and I want to question you when you talk about the technology being agnostic. Companies are creating and developing and pushing these apps because they're driven by a profit motive. Governments are also pushing some of this, and in some cases, authoritarian governments, because they actually want greater surveillance and control over. So your China example was fascinating, given what we know about what's happening with the Chinese state and surveillance mechanisms of its own citizens. And then, of course, parents are extending the reach of their own oversight. So when Ki Beng said, aren't we lucky we grew up before this? I think that was partly this sense in which we're being watched all the time. And it certainly brings to my own mind a sense of discomfort, I have to say. How would you answer?
So a year ago or 2 years ago, right at the height of the pandemic, there was a lamp that was marketed in China by ByteDance, the company behind TikTok. It was called 大力灯. And this lamp is basically a study lamp that will allow you to have your child be tutored virtually by someone you hire, so that that person, can, walk your child through the homework and so on. What else can the lamp do? It can actually monitor your child's posture when they are sitting doing their homework. And it will also send you notifications as to why, whether your child's finished the homework, and it will give you, it could even recite poetry and so on. Guess what? It was by no means inexpensive, but it flew off the shelves in China where it was marketed because the parents felt that, hey, this is a fantastic tool that will allow me to exercise supervision over my child if I'm busy at work or if I'm at the mall getting groceries and so on, right? So I think I had another op-ed where I titled it, "One Person's Surveillance is Another Person's Love." Which is essentially that on the one hand, you feel like you're surveilling, the person who's being surveilled may feel that they're being surveilled, but the person who's doing the surveilling feels that it's an act of love, right? And so there's that sort of disjuncture in the values. So anyway, I'm not by any means advocating for that. What I always do explain is that there is software that parents can install in their children's devices that will alert you if your child has strayed into some unsavory websites and so on. And that's when, as a parent, you might want to have that talk with your child, right? But that if you wanted to install that kind of software, you shouldn't do it covertly. It must be from an open agreement with the child. It must be, at mutual agreement where you've actually discussed the implications and so on. And very often, the families that do choose to use this technology, I think that it's probably too little too late, that there's probably been some measure of family dysfunction that has forced the parents to, have to resort to such technologies, and that the technology is not going to help, that fundamentally it needs to be a relationship where there's open communication, where there's mutual respect, where there is a discussion of the boundaries. So I do not subscribe to nor advocate for surveillance.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. Is there anyone I could report you to? Maybe my last question, and it's a much more generic question about social media and so on. Obviously, something I don't do a great deal of, using my phone and so on. And that's the mental health issues that have surfaced that are very, very noticeable. In some societies, it's become a matter of concern for public policy. In other societies, and I have to say in many Asian societies, it's still a taboo to talk about mental health issues, especially those that attend the young people. And you yourself speak a little bit towards the end of the book about the possibility of this technology being used for self-aggrandizement, you know, the lack of civility, the lack of rules that attend, you know, the way people use social media, you know, a culture of rampant egotism that's there, the toxicity, to use a word that's often used. And I didn't see enough, it's there, but I know in your own work, I mean, and your own activism around questions of what can we put in place to mitigate harms done. And again, I go back to gender because, you know, young women in particular are the absolute targets of a great deal of this. You know, so it's sexist and misogynistic as well as just being generically toxic. Or am I being far too negative out there? It kind of hothouses, it seems to me, hothouses a lot of, and it valorizes, one of your favorite words, a lot of not very nice behavior, actually. This kind of ultra competitiveness. It's like, you know, pitching our kid versus your kid and so on and so on. Now, realists, or those who claim to be realists, might say, well, that's the real world and you're going to have to compete and so on and so on. As the Marlon Brando godfather figure to a kid that is homeschooled, I'm kind of really glad that she isn't part of all of that world, you know, that kind of world. But how do you deal with, I mean, because I think you accept its existence, but how do you deal with the kind of, you know, the negative, nasty, noxious, there's a lot of N's there, norms that also pervade this world that you describe?
So you've set the stage for my next book. So my next book actually is tentatively titled Algorithmic Childhood, where I will be unpacking how a lot of the algorithms that drive these social media platforms as well as other digital infrastructures essentially will push up certain kinds of content, right? So unfortunately, a lot of the content that's sensationalist, that, you know, draws very extreme reactions, that's toxic, that's nauseous, is going to get a lot of attention. And then it drives its way up to the social media feed. It gets more eyeballs than it should deserve and so on. And this is an issue. And you talked about young women being the target of online harms, being the target of online abuse. Interestingly, in the research that I did with the Alliance for Action to Tackle Online Harms, we found that young women were themselves also very often perpetrators of online abuse. So, you know, it's not as though, and the cause of this is that there is a certain degree of normalization, the kinds of normalization around how, oh, you know, people say these things all the time, or why are you so easily offended? And, you know, you really shouldn't be so sensitive and so on, right? And so people who then suffer online abuse don't report it as much as they should. They feel that they should just learn to suck it up, one of the famous teen phrases. So this is something that we've got to change, which I'm trying to do with the Alliance for Action work on online harms. And yes, it is troubling, and fundamentally also, as I've written elsewhere, social media as it is designed today is also highly flawed, highly defective in terms of the levels of gross visibility that you have. You can't actually calibrate whom you want to be visible to as well as you would like. And that has all kinds of implications around what you can say, whom you can say it to safely and comfortably, and so on.
Ki Ben showed me as you were speaking new statistics about suicide rates, and they're horrifying. And they've really spiked over the last few years. And many of those countries are some of the high-end, middle-class Asian countries. South Korean suicides, especially among young people, have just gone through the roof and so on. Now, I'm not attributing all of that to this singular cause, but I mean, I think there's a particular context in which, and we know, I mean, those of us who follow the news, you know, the kind of, this wonderful society, it's the most connected society in the world, I believe, South Korea and so on. But, you know, levels of open abuse, again, especially of young women, is absolutely rampant and so on. So sorry for that slight downside. I'm glad you've got a topic for a new book. Can I be the editor?
Of course.
We just signed the deal in front of a room full
All
of
these
witnesses. Yes. Now, it's about time that we heard from you. Now, I mean, most people here would have been parents. I think most of you would have been young people once. A few people in the room, I doubt that. You know, some people were born old and wise. That's very, very nice. And we have some genuine young people, and we need to hear from. So please, questions from the floor, and maybe in the usual way, just like identify who you are so that we know you're not an agent of the surveillance state.
Thank you, Prof. Lim. Well, I have to say, well, I've always thought of schooling as rather coercive in my own experience. So there's always an element of coercion in schooling, right? So exam-driven learning and all that we can discuss that some other time. But I'm wondering, for your research and what you were talking about, it seems to be you're focusing on rather young children, right?
Yes, primary school and high school. Yes.
Because it made me think also about as the child grows, and we remain parents all our life, know that, right? But if we think of the child, our children, as school children, all the way up to the tertiary level, the way they would relate to technology would change quite dramatically, I think, between primary, secondary, tertiary. At some point, the child is not going to let you surveil it or whatever, right? So, so some of the pan-optimal perspective that Jared pointed out seems to me more possible at kindergarten and primary school. But as it goes on, I would think that how the child relates to technology would start to change. And perhaps by the time they're 18 or 19, they start switching to listening to podcasts and so on. So I find that rather interesting how they would change. And also because these technologies are rather new still. So as they come at the time, if a child is 15, I think they will relate to these technologies in a different way from a child who's 7 when these technologies come, right? So they're more overwhelmed by it, I think, among the very young.
Just it was also, if I could just interject and add to that, it was also the case that during the pandemic, university students were now also being taught online, often by very brilliant professors who had no idea really how to be adept at using the technology. That's a reality. I used to teach summer schools for Japanese students who visit Penang, but I did 2 years of this online with students whose grasp of English was fairly moderate, but who in a live face-to-face environment, you could have all kinds of interesting levels of encouragement and class support and so on. But in fact, I was teaching 15 Japanese students, each locked in their own room and so on and so on. And it was a very thin gruel, I have to say, in terms of a pedagogical learning experience. So I think some of these tools have been developed, and old academic friends of mine saying, what the hell am I doing? You know, what is this? This kind of, they themselves feel incredibly burdened. They don't feel particularly adept. So the same kinds of tools are being developed even by universities, and then they're being sold on to other universities.
So thank you for your question. In fact, what you say about how children enter the technology equation at different eras is very true. My first child was born in 2003. My second was born in 2006. And guess what was born in 2007? The iPhone. And when the iPhone came along, it changed a lot of the intensity of connectivity across diverse platforms, the ease, the immediacy, and all that. But when you look also at broader sociological literature around early adulthood, right, we are looking at kids who enter university display early adulthood at slightly later ages. In other words, there is a kind of extended adolescence where even university students still are quite tied to the apron strings of the parents. And to some extent, a lot of this is enabled digitally. I remember one of my university students did research on Singaporean kids who were working overseas and how they communicated with their parents back home. And these were young adults. And there was a young woman whose mother from Singapore would call her every day in China to wake her up to get her to work. Similarly, my research in Vietnam, and this was of Vietnamese university students in Singapore, even though they came from fairly rural areas, when they moved to Singapore, they would make sure that their parents had digital connectivity. And the parents would then check out their Facebook accounts. And there was one instance where the parents could not get in touch with their Vietnamese kid in Singapore and went and looked at their social media footprints and eventually called the friend of one of the kids in Vietnam and asked the Vietnamese kid to call her back. And it's that level of surveillance that can be done also through what I call the digital footprints, which I also mentioned in the book. And there's another example where I had a father who was going to lunch in Singapore, and his daughter sent him a message through her app called Companion, which basically allowed him to follow her and keep her company while she went home to her dorm in New Haven in Connecticut, because she was going home at a late hour, which was 1 a.m. in New Haven. And this was 1 p.m., Singapore. But he would keep her company on the way back to her dorm. And so there are all of these different ways by which parents can continue to be digitally connected to their kids and be able to exercise remote guidance and oversight. So it's, I don't think it will necessarily end, and there will always be other ways that it will evolve over time.
I'll just add on to that. I wonder, your talk largely is based on education itself, the schooling system, and the parent playing a role within the schooling system. But of course, transcendent parenting involves technology outside of school, right? Which is your example. That to me is rather essentially different in a way, because it's between the parent and the child and the technology. But when you have the parent, the child, and the school, which is full of people and states and whatnot, it becomes, so the parent in that case becomes an accomplice in the surveillance of the child. While the case you mentioned, it's technology being used in a rather cute way, in a way, right? A hologramic parenting in a way. But yeah, that's what I think. It's the school example. I think is, well, it's one side of parenting, I suppose. But technology and parenting, just between the child and the parent, I think it can be a different story, right?
Indeed, it can be a different story. So I guess it was maybe the emphasis of my talk, but in the book, I also talk about how parents use the connectivity to exercise oversight over their children. I did emphasize more on the talk, during the talk, on the educational side of the house, because there is also this trend of what sociologists call the scholarization of childhood, which is that essentially children around the world are essentially nurtured to be good students, right? Or to be students, as opposed to earlier eras where children might be mobilized into labor and so on. But now, because schooling is such a central feature of lives of children around the world, the educational landscape and how it digitalizes will have a strong bearing, therefore, on the parent-child relationship and technology.
Hi. Hello. thanks so much, Prof. Lim, for the very interesting talk. I'm Albert Liao. I'm a developmental psychologist. I used to work in Singapore, so I had the opportunity to meet Prof. Lim once or twice. I was at the National Institute of Education. Now I'm based in Penang. I really like the term transcendent parenting. As a parent myself, I think that's what we really have to do. We always have to transcend whatever we're doing, so that we get to know what our children are doing. I have one daughter. What the question I have is, you all mentioned about surveillance and incursion and so on. I was wondering to what extent the trends you're talking about, like all this surveillance parents are doing, and getting involved in their children's fights and so on. To what extent is it part of this trend of helicopter parenting, right? Like parents being too involved. Then there's this idea that parents are too involved, and so the young are now like very fragile. The Chinese term, right? The strawberry generation. Recently, Penang and Malaysia is famous for durian. I don't know whether you had a chance to eat, but it'll be very expensive now. Now it's not the season, but so I heard this term, like instead of helicopter parenting, we should be durian parents, so that our children are resilient like durian. So that was an interesting term. So I'm just wondering, like you mentioned about the alliance, the work you're doing, the alliance. What can we do to, I guess, I don't know, discourage parents from being too involved? Like you say, is the social media sucks you in, right? If you're not part of the WhatsApp parent group, then you feel that you're missing out. But then once you're in it, then you just get too involved in it, and you don't want to lose out and so on. So yeah, just wondering what can we do as a society, or how do we strike a better balance?
Right. Thank you for that question. I wish I had called my book Durian Parenting. I think I would have sold many copies, many more copies. I did write an op-ed sort of to introduce the book, and the opinion editor actually asked me to be a little bit more prescriptive in terms of suggesting how we can deal with some of these phenomena. And I think, with academic books, you try to sort of restrain yourself from being overly prescriptive, but I did venture into that territory when I was writing that op-ed. And one of the things that I suggested was that schools actually should be a little bit more proactive about setting norms and guidelines around how these WhatsApp chats should be run, what kinds of terms should be used, how people should, restrain their behavior, right, in these WhatsApp chats and not allow the discussions to escalate. I mean, it's very much like decency guidelines in any online forums that you will join. And I think that schools can play a greater role in terms of educating parents about how not to abuse these platforms and how to use them with greater civility and greater decency. And thankfully, interviewing some of the parents, some of them were sort of like moderators or volunteers in these chats. And they shared with me that they did try to encourage more positive behavior. There was actually a very troubling case which I read about, where a particular WhatsApp chat of a new school group of parents. It was early in the school year, and the parent posted a photo of a bunch of kids in the school that she had obviously had the opportunity to take. And then she shares it with the chat, and she goes, "Who is the parent of this child?" And she had circled the child. And, it was so confrontational, the question and so on. But that just goes to illustrate the extremes to which such platforms can be abused, right? You can imagine how alarming it must be to be that parent of that circled child, to receive that message. What are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to say? And I think, it's these kinds of communication that people are so unaccustomed to, because, hey, 10 years ago, WhatsApp didn't exist, right? We were living our lives happily. And then suddenly now we've got this, everyone's connected, everyone's sharing stuff. How are we supposed to behave? The norms are just not properly set. And so, that's where I feel institutions and agencies that I'm part of, like the Media Literacy Council, we can do more to educate people.
Francois.
Yes, thanks. My name is Francois Fortier, and I'm retired now, but I used to do the research. I mean, in a field somewhat related to that as well. to yours. And there are 4 issues that somewhat tickle me, but I will be very brief, and then you can see which aspect you would like to answer. One is about labor. You did not mention how it affects actually the labor force in the education sector. And it seems to me that if teachers now have to answer back to 30, 40, 50, 60 parents and keep them abreast of what's going on in the classroom all the time, that must have a huge impact. So I don't know, I wonder what kind of evidence you came across in your research on the labor. On the gender aspect, and Gareth already mentioned that, there's the element, and you seem rather optimistic about how the evolution of society in general will somewhat be brought to reflect in how technology will enable a better gender balance. I would be somewhat more pessimistic, or rather maybe question if that technology is not in fact reproducing and reinforcing gender division of labor within the family, and reinforcing trends that we would rather be seen to be challenged. So that's maybe one aspect. It seems to me, maybe that's more a comment on your question, or maybe you want to add something on this. The third question is about the autonomy, which again reaches several of the interventions about the panopticon element of total surveillance, the loss of privacy for kids. I mean, human rights and privacy don't start at 18 years old. They start before that. And kids also have rights to privacy, which seem to be negated by many parents, even more now that they have access to technologies like this. And my concern here is the long-term trend beyond the individual examples, and many of which that are very interesting that you give. To what extent the long-term trends is not to diminish autonomy and responsibility, which is part of what school is about, not just academic education, but really learning how to live in society. And that aspect, if the girls are going to be woken up by their parents calling them in the morning, or if I don't learn that by, as a kid, if I forget my red shirt, there are consequences to this for messing up the national holiday, then this is something I need to learn. And if my parents, or my mother more specifically, is always there to tell me not to forget my shirt, and I will never learn what the consequences is. So to what extent can we expect long-term consequences on the buildup of autonomy? That's the third one. And last, and I think is something would be very interesting. Have you seen again evidences of how the technology is appropriated by kids in a resistance? You said at the beginning resistance is futile, but I'm sure kids would see it differently. If they appropriate the technology in resisting those trends and building autonomy with a technology which in the end they master much more than their parents. Thank you.
Thank you. So the very first question about labor, that's an excellent question. And indeed, I have spoken to teachers who have shared with me how stressful it can be. And you're dealing with a class of 30 pupils. That translates into 30 possibly demanding parents. And some of these teachers, for some reason, they feel duty bound to respond very quickly. And some of them, actually many principals, as well as the Ministry of Education, have shared with me that they have very clear guidelines that, teachers should not share their personal numbers with parents and so on. But some teachers still feel that they want to go the extra mile and they want to be that responsive teacher. And to some extent, I think this will also set unhealthy norms for other teachers who choose to be a little bit less, more detached from their jobs, if you will, right? So generally, I think that there are actually officially guidelines against teachers being overly responsive on such platforms, and that there should be a certain measure of reasonable expectations as to how responsive teachers should be. But you are right, teachers do feel stressed. They do see it as yet another aspect of the work that they must undertake. So I believe your second question was around the gender biases, right? So with regard to the gender biases, yes, to some extent, you will see that with a lot of the new technology platforms, you see how they reproduce the pre-existing biases. But again, I want to remain hopeful, because I think that when the connectivity and the reach of the devices is pretty universal, that, the schools should be able to reach both parents equally through mediated communication, right? It shouldn't just be that the less burdened parent is the one who should be responding. We should set up systems to be communicating with both parents at all times, so that both parents are always kept in the know. And I think the more we build these kinds of neutrality into the communication practices, the better the chances are of equalizing the responsibilities. It's a long road, but I think, we've got to at least try. The third question was about the rights for children. Yes, so this is actually going to be a growing issue, because we are also seeing, for example, schools having to be custodians of children's data when children are using educational platforms, right? And schools don't necessarily have the resources to, manage data that in such a watertight fashion. We've seen in the US, for example, there have been data breaches where children's data from educational platforms is actually being shared with third parties and so on. And this is something that is very troubling. So the conversation has only just begun on digital rights for children. There is growing movements within Europe, as well as California at least, for the digital rights of children to be much more concretely recognized, and for the big tech companies to be much more well apprised of how they should honor children's digital rights. Even, for example, the terms and conditions for websites that are targeted at children, there is a drive to get children to help to rewrite some of these so that they are in child-friendly language, and children actually know what they're getting into when they sign on to particular websites and online services. So the discourse around digital rights for children is strengthening, and that's something that, again, is a long road, but it's people are embarking on it. The last question. Yes, resisting. So I think, as much as children can be surveilled, as much as they can be trail online, they will find ways to get around things. So, for example, when I interviewed a bunch of high school kids back in the day, and they were kids who were at risk, some of them were engaging in juvenile offenses and so on. They were very clever about, for example, maintaining different kinds of Facebook accounts for different audiences. And I think there are children out there, who've got Instagram accounts for parents safe, and Instagram accounts that are for friends and so on. There are also all kinds of ways to ghost your parents by, saying that your phone battery was flat, that you were, just inconvenienced, weren't able to answer the call. I've had university students teach me that if I want someone to not see that I have read their message, I should switch to airline mode, read the message, and then, just not be online for a few hours so that they don't know that you've read and blue tick them, right? So there are all these tips and tricks by which people can manage their visibility. And I think that's also, there's always some room for creativity and circumnavigation that you can count on kids to come up with. So yes,
what's it like having a mum who knows all the tricks? That's a major problem, isn't it?
I think they will disagree with you that I know all the tricks.
We'll chat after, okay? We've still got some time to go. This is fantastic. Yes, please.
I want to share an anecdote of my son's, which is that he was the last man standing in his primary school class. He was the last one not to have a mobile phone. And he was very upset. And he said to me, if you didn't research into this topic, I would have a mobile phone. But yes. Sorry.
I have a question from a technology perspective. Given the stress and the challenges of parenting,
yes,
do you see society moving towards autonomous parenting?
Can you unpack that for me?
Think of it this way. I mean, that's where consumer electronics is moving to. It's generally autonomous. So given the parents have to track their children's digital communication with the school, and so on and so forth, and they have their own work to do, they will love to have a platform that manage all of this for them in the background and distill down just what they need to know. And also, for example, the example you gave about the bike dance device, there's a very simple type of autonomous parenting in terms of getting the child to have a better posture. See, parents do not necessarily need to be there. The device itself will try to correct the children. So it's a type of autonomous parenting itself.
So you may not be there, but the underside of autonomous parenting is quantification, which is that essentially a lot of data is being captured about your child. Your child was using his phone for how many hours? Your child went to XYZ websites. Your child has played, all these video games and so on. So there is actually no autonomy in the sense that you are kind of enslaved to all these notifications and all this data that you're going to be bombarded with by all these services that you think you have delegated all these tasks to.
Autonomous computing would do is to collect all your massive generic data. They would distill down to only and through, for example, different methods of artificial intelligence or machine learning. It's possible to distill down to only critical information that the parent would be interested in. So it's not necessary you as the parent will still have to go through all the data.
Yes.
The system will process it all. So
yes, I know, but it will still be notifications. And I can tell you that I've interviewed parents who have signed on to versions of what you call autonomous parenting. And these are the software that tracks your child's device use, that tracks, what kinds of sites they've been visiting and so on. And they feel inundated with notifications, and they feel that they've got to act upon them. So it's not as if the data goes into a void. It could be, as a parent, I could ignore all of these.
no, it's the data being processed and distilled. The key is distillation.
Yes, it is distilled. It comes in a nice notification. It doesn't give you a wealth of data.
I mean, in the sense that you'll go through the information and then distill if it's necessary
Yes.
to notify the parent.
Yes, yes.
So it actually extracts the data itself.
Yes. So, for example, there will be software that will track that maybe a certain word has been used in your child's communication, and then they will alert you if you highlight those particular words.
That's too primitive. Technology at this moment is much higher than that.
Yeah, I know. But at the end of the day, the data still has to be sent to the parents in the form of a notification.
Yes, but it will be much less than what is the example you gave. You have massive amount of WhatsApp.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. The WhatsApp, for example, can be parsed and it can be, compressed, right? And there's already software that does these kinds of things. But ultimately, as the parents, you have to call the shots as to what this data is telling you and what you should do with the data. I know you're saying that the data has been condensed, but you still got to make the judgment call.
To a certain extent, but it can go beyond that. It's like autonomous driving.
So is your bot going to inform the principal to withdraw your child from the school after the punch up in the school field? Yeah, well, when we get to that day, I think it will be a very sad day for parents, or maybe a very happy one, depending on which side you're on.
Let's take a couple more.
Thank you. Thank you, son. Really enjoyed it very much. I'm glad I'm not a parent. I'm glad I'm not a teacher. And I'm really glad I'm not a student. As a parent, I think what I haven't heard is what is the role of a parent to the child? That's before the child gets to school, before the child is taught manners, before the child is taught discipline. What then becomes the role? Because everything I hear from a teacher's point of view, it's not fun. It's a lot of, instead of educating that student as a whole type of education, they're spending so much time doing what we're talking about. And I think that is the problem, because when I look at what our young people are, and I look at our young people, and I spend quite a lot of time with young people, I coach football anyway, but it is that, to me, if all these things were sufficed at the home, and I understand with mothers working, fathers working, this time factor it's a missing point for that individual who is going, I think, unprepared for education in a manner that he cannot cope with fully. And then now even the parents have to assume all this information to be able to cope with the way that education is processed. And I know that what I'm saying is that we have to go back, but maybe your next book will be on parenting and how a parent prepares their child. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Actually, now I recall Francois had a very interesting question about the consequences of the child always having the digital reminders and the connectivity. And that was an interesting thread that ran through a few conversations with parents who resisted the urge. Even though they knew what the teachers had told the kids through the apps, they resisted the urge to tell their children because they wanted their children to learn to be autonomous, to learn to manage their own school lives, and to then learn to live with the consequences of not having kept up. And they didn't want to be parents who were there to rescue their kids all the time. So I'm happy to say, in response to the most recent question, which is that there are parents who have the privilege to see that there is a bigger picture in all of this, that their role is to be loving parents, and that ultimately, like it or not, you do get swept up in that pressure cooker, you do get swept up in the day-to-day mundanity of getting your child to school on time and so on. But all of this is really born out of love. They want their children to thrive and to succeed and to be happy in school. And that's where, across all of the parents, you do see that sense of care, that sense of duty.
Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting evening. This pressure cooker, this hot housing, there's all sorts of words there. I'm reminded that I was born in an age of social mobility. In the first third of my life, we were taking it for granted. We were socially mobile. We even got grants to go to college and university. In the next 2/3 of my life, that mobility has decreased enormously. I have a sense that the middle classes, the urban middle classes that you referred to all over the world, are caught in a terrible trap. Those that have the means and have the will to do it get caught up in this becoming like a new aristocracy, in their Chelsea tractors, in their delivering to the piano lessons, in the doing all of this technology to monitor their children. But maybe, like Western society, the aristocracy is so trapped that it will ultimately collapse.
So that there is a term that I reference in my book called the parentocracy, which is that parents who've got the resources and the intellectual wherewithal will, channel quite a lot of energy into giving their children the best social capital possible, and that they contribute to that educational arms race, getting your child the enrichment classes, getting your child every advantage. I will await the consequences as you will, I'm sure, as to whether your doomsday scenario will come true.
We've got a little bit of time, if you've still got a little bit of time, but I've noticed we haven't had a single question from a woman, not one. Now we've got two. Lee first and then Chung.
This sort of follows up with the gender imbalance you were mentioning earlier. And it's not really a question, but an observation. I've had children I've been a parent in these WhatsApp groups and working with these apps. And I've also been a teacher. on the other end of these, working with apps and not necessarily WhatsApp groups, but various interfaces. And what I've noticed with both, and I just wonder whether this, have you also noticed this, is it seems to have brought men into the educating burden in a way that I haven't noticed before, in that at least 50% of the participants were fathers. And I just wondered whether that, I was constantly getting emails from fathers. And I noticed that although the fathers on the WhatsApp groups might be a little bit quieter, there were also a lot of fathers on WhatsApp groups. But as a teacher, I was getting a lot of emails from fathers, which isn't what I had expected. And I just wondered if that had been something you've also noticed, that this digital connectivity sort of brings fathers into education.
That certainly is something that I hope. Because of my research approach, I didn't have access to these kinds of data. I didn't, for example, conduct a survey on gender differentiation in parental participation in educational platforms and so on. So I'm afraid I don't have data. My hunch is that with technological devices, and if you think about the technology industry and gender representation in the tech industry, the fact that technology is still male-dominated suggests that males are more conversant with technology, that within the household there may be some delegation of technological duties to the father, and that may extend to educational platforms. So that may account for some of the trends that you're seeing. Certainly, with regard to the purchase of technological devices within the home, there is data to show that fathers tend to be more involved in the decisions around which technology to buy. And so that also could speak to the greater fluency with technology that men display that may now be creeping into the educational landscape, which could account for what you're seeing. So that again is another encouraging sign. But the downside of it is that we've got to think about how to upskill women in technology so that they don't, they're left behind in terms of employment prospects.
Thanks. Chang?
Yeah, thanks. My question is about the relationship between the socio-political system and the level of penetration of the technology into schooling, parenting, which bring, control and surveillance. So I just wonder if, for example, you mentioned Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, they all seem to share the same kind of political structure. So is it in other more open society, do you see the same level of penetration, same level of control? And because my concern is that the way the government, the schooling authorities allow that kind of, parenting and controlling or the schooling will produce future citizens that are much more docile or, how you can tolerable to that kind of control. And is that something that, I'm talking conspiracy here, is it part of a bigger, project that want to turn people into just sheep, that kind of, yeah.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, you're right. In terms of the sort of thresholds of acceptance for surveillance, it does vary from country to country. And I think we've also seen, for example, China really going quite aggressively into facial surveillance in all kinds of realms. And the technology is very refined for that. And yet also across the pandemic period, we saw more countries having digital identification, for example, contact tracing types of software. So we are also interestingly seeing what I would call that transactional relationship that people have with technology, which is that people actually are prepared to give up some measure of privacy in exchange for convenience. And you see it, for example, with the super apps that will, be able to track when you are likely to order your meal, and they're able to suggest to you certain things right at a certain time and so on. And there's actually growing research to show that depending on the age and the generation of the users, maybe not so much socio-political climate, that people are prepared to give up privacy in exchange for surveillance, whether it's surveillance capitalism by commercial entities or possibly by the state. We don't know, but I think that's a very interesting factor to take into account.
Yeah, fantastically interesting. I take one more if there is one more. But we've done a good time, haven't we? We've done well, I think. We've done well, haven't we?
Yes, absolutely.
Kat, please, Kat. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm from the Philippines and I'm a mother, so I'll be asking this question. These pressures, is it going towards, because my experience is on alternative learning systems, and a lot of this felt very redundant. Like, why are we sending kids and paying for private school if they will come home and we will have to do all of these things again? So you tend to ask then that, okay, what's the value of a teacher then? If the individual customized learning will still have to happen in school. So, and then you're also describing how much the burden is on the teacher because the model is changing inevitably, that parents will be going through them, or the children are getting used to personalized attention as well. So maybe the system itself, the education the pedagogy or the methodology itself is bound for disruption, and all of this pressure. I think, it's like, this is insane. Sometimes I was like, this is insane. Why am I? This is a redundancy then. Like, so why do I send my kid to school if they can just watch it at Khan Academy and we cannot really be assured that the teacher is better than online content anyway? So those things are coming up for me, and all of this also reflect that it looks like an inefficiency and we keep on piling on it because we keep on holding on to a legacy system. So that's
No, I totally feel your pain, but I think if there was one thing that did demonstrate the virtue of schools, it was the pandemic. Because after the lockdown, when children returned to schools, to have that benefit of socialization, to have the messiness of face-to-face interaction, I think that certainly was something that people really missed and they saw the value of, right? But the trend that you're talking about, I think, is very much exacerbated by not just digitalization, but quantification. That because now a lot of educational activities can be computed, it can be quantified, a lot of it is presented as data, and that's where a lot of the burden is then pushed to parents that, look, this is what the data is saying, and this is what you should be doing, and so on. And I don't see this as a healthy trend either. I think the sort of obsession with quantification actually leads to resource channeling in the wrong areas in terms of educational interventions. And that's something that I might deal with in my book as well. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Kat, for that. We're going to sort of draw things to a close now. 2 or 3 small little reflections from me. When I was a student, in the pre-digital age, you may be surprised to hear, we had a great guru in kind of educational critical thinking, and that was Paulo Freire, not somebody from the West. And, sometimes this juxtaposition between something called Asia and something called the West grates at me. He's a Brazilian. Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's an old-fashioned title, it's a beautiful book. But it spoke to me when I was thinking about this, because he talked about 2 different models of learning. The banking model, the notion of the child as the empty vessel into which you invest and pour, norms and resources and knowledge, like the empty vessel, versus the co-creator, the student as co-creator and so on. And I don't see very much of the co-creation aspect, the agency. And you may say, well, agency of a 7-year-old or whatever, but then Ki Beng made the point about as you travel through the ages and get older, surely the question of student agency is an important one. Second, to think that the data companies themselves can engage in any kind of altruistic self-regulation is the road to perdition, AKA the road to hell. I mean, you're asking Silicon Valley bros to kind of regulate themselves in a way that they are not creating future consumers and so on and so on. They are about creating the addictive behavior. And, you know, they staff themselves full of psychologists and whatever precisely to study these kinds of behavioral norms. It's scary. It's my own view. 1984, I think I'm going to go back and read it again. And the final thing I want to say, very, very personal. I don't know about you two lovely young people. When I was 18, I didn't want my mum and dad to know what I was doing. I mean, sex, drugs, and rock and roll is a thing. And we learn, and we fell, and we messed up sometimes and whatever. But I'd still love my mom and call her from, I go to a little red telephone kiosk. I don't know if those of you know Britain, and you put in 1 shilling and beep, 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 beep. Oh man, it's engaged. And okay, I'll come back next week. I'll call mum next week. And, you know, I had a beautiful relationship with my mom. It's just that she wasn't on my head and she'd given me enough sense of autonomy. By the way, as a migrant woman living in Britain, by the age of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, to have a sense of responsibility and a sense of duty of care to the others I came into and whatever. And eventually I told her about the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but that was much later. I'm not really actually being facetious because it's speaking to this idea of how can we as parents, I'm not one, how can parents, you know, actually entrust? Because there's a question of trust there about the independence and autonomy and resilience and all of that kind of stuff without actually calling them in New Haven and saying what you're having for breakfast and so on. Listen, it's been a really splendid evening, some really great contributions from the floor. So, of course, as you'd expect from a Penang audience. And Alan, you're very lucky. But I'm going to ask the kids about whether the gender equality is really, really working out at home. But in the meantime, can we give a very, very warm Penang thank you to Professor Lim Sun Sun.
Thank you for being such a lovely audience, really. Thank you.
And she's now promised to do a free surgery for all your problems with kids. Here up front in public.